Is it? Yeah? Okay, very good. Welcome to the Wilson Center. Welcome to the Washington History Seminar, co-organized by the National History Center and the Wilson Center. And welcome to this presentation, the seminar with Professor Gabriel Gorodetsky, who will speak about the Russian Imperial Legacy, Stalin and the Outbreak of the War in the East, Barbarossa. Before Roger and I will introduce Professor Gorodetsky, let me just mention that next week we will have Tom Schwartz from Vanderbilt University talking about Kissinger's Realpolitik and American exceptionalism, as always at 4 o'clock on Monday in this room. We have the privilege and pleasure today to hear from Professor Gorodetsky, who is known to many of you. He is a member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, a Quantum Fellow at All Souls College in Oxford, and the holder of the Rubin Chair for Russian Studies at Tel Aviv University. He is actually also an alumnus of the Wilson Center, so it's a great pleasure to welcome him back. He served as the founder and director of the Cummings Center for Russian Studies at Tel Aviv University, was also a visiting fellow at St. Anthony's. He's taught at a number of universities, including Munich and Cologne, at Central European University in Budapest. He has a long list of publications to his credit. I'll just mention Stafford Cripps's mission to Moscow, 1940-42, and Grand Delusion, Stalin and the German Invasion of Russia, which connects, of course, with today's talk. He studied history and Russian studies at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, went on to obtain his PhD under the supervision of renowned British historian E.H. Carr in Oxford. He was honored last year by Russian State University for Humanities in Moscow with an honorary doctorate, and delighted to say he's also been involved in past activities and conspiracies of the Center's Cold War International History Project, including a large international conference on Stalin and the Cold War many years ago. So it's a real pleasure to welcome him back. With that, let me turn it over to my co-chair, Roger Lewis. Let me not enter without thanking the Society of Historians for American Foreign Relations for supporting this series. We're grateful for Schaefer's support. Roger.
Before I say a word about Gabby, could we go through our ritual of letting everyone introduce himself and herself? Let's begin with the Executive Director of the American Historical Association.
I'm Jim Grossman.
David Nichols at the Department of State.
Joanna Mantello at American University.
Bruce Barrett, Fellow at the Kennan Institute.
James Sang, retired.
Carol Sang, retired historian.
Don Wolfensberger with the Wilson Center.
Vaughn Hardesty, the National Air and Space Museum of Smithsonian.
Francisco Rodriguez, Fulbright Scholar at George Washington University.
Steve Lipson, graduate student at Catholic University.
Stanley Falk, historian.
Boris Lanin, Woodrow Wilson Center Fellow.
Sonia Michelle, Director of U.S. Studies at the Wilson Center.
Ross Johnson, Wilson Center and the Hoover Institution.
Jean-Pierre Filius, Sciences Po Paris, presently visiting at Columbia.
Bill Burr, National Security Archive.
Melissa Stockdale, Wilson Center Fellow.
Margaret Yeo, Wilson Center Intern.
Evgeny Tsimbal, Kennan Institute Fellow, Film Director.
Claricity Sudhir, American Historical Association.
Michael Neufeld, National Air and Space Museum, Smithsonian.
Mel Leffler, University of Virginia, and a Wilson Center.
Ronald Steele, Wilson Center, and the University of Southern California.
Alexei Antoshin, Kennan Fulbright School.
Margot Bedron, Senior Scholar, Wilson Center.
Al Schmidt, retired professor in history and law.
Alice Pino, intern at the Cold War History Project.
Tim McDonald with the Wilson Center.
Peter Bierstaker, also with the Wilson Center.
Charles Mayer, the fellow at the Wilson Center and at Harvard.
Leslie Bethel, Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Rio and senior scholar at the Wilson Center.
Chris Barrett, scholar here at the Wilson Center.
Granville Austin, no illustrious affiliations.
Former Wilson Center fellow.
Let me just say that Gabi divides his time between Tel Aviv, where he was the founder of the Russian Studies Center, Cologne, Oxford at All Souls, and he is now a visiting fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study, where he is carrying on with his great work on the diaries of Ivan Maisky. This is a work that resembles almost a study in medieval text. It is to be published in 3 volumes by the Yale University Press. I want to say just one other thing about Gabi, and that he is a musician as well as a historian. He plays classical clarinet, and the rumor at All Souls is that when he comes to a seminar meeting such as the one that we're at today, he gives people the choice whether they actually want to hear his talk or whether they would actually like to hear him play a clarinet concerto.
But when I speak about Stalin, I give no one a choice.
And today we have no choice because he doesn't have his clarinet with him. So this is Gabriel Garodowski on Barbarossa.
Well, thank you very much, Christian and Roger, for the introduction. I always have a feeling that someone else is introduced rather than me, but I would accept your, of course, your very kind words. Well, the history of the origins of the Second World War in the East, or the Great Patriotic War, has emerged as the most contentious historical debate in Russia since the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991. A debate which has spilled over beyond Russia's border, mostly, as I shall explain, to Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states. But its reverberations are felt in Western Europe as well as in the United States. In fact, scarcely a year ago, the American Foreign Policy Council hosted an intimate working luncheon with a certain Viktor Suvorov in Washington, which was then followed right here at the Wilson Center by the launching of his newest book with a provocative title, Chief Culprit, Stalin's Grand Design to Start World War. This is the best picture I could get of his performance here, and here is the book. Now, the debate started as a low-key affair. In 1984, that same Suvorov published an article in the well-known Paris-based White Russian emigre paper, Russkaya Misl, in which he inter alias insinuated that Hitler's surprise attack on Russia on the 22nd of June, 1941, was preemptive. This is the paper, and this is the article. Suvorov, it should be stated right away, is a rather presumptuous pseudonym, assumed by Captain Vladimir Rezun, a junior officer in a small cog in Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, who defected to the West in 1978. The choice of Suvorov as a pseudonym after the great Russian commander of the late 18th century, the famous fourth and in fact last Russian generalissimo, if one excludes Stalin, who had never lost a battle, is in itself quite revealing. Here's the young original Suvorov, the elder, the young, and the elder. After being thoroughly debriefed by MI5, Rezun was settled down in Oxfordshire and produced a number of mildly interesting books on his experience in Soviet intelligence. And the article in Russkaya Misl suggesting Stalin's aggressive intentions against Germany was Suvorov's first venture into history in circumstances which are beyond this lecture. It was further elaborated a year later and published in Russi, the highly respectful journal of the British Royal United Service Institute, whose patron is no other than Her Majesty the Queen, under the provocative title of Who Was Planning to Attack Whom in June 1941, Hitler or Stalin? This is the journal. You can see the patron at the top of the page. Now, having examined this period in depth, I decided to publish a rebuttal, which appeared in the same journal under the title, Was Stalin Really Planning to Attack Hitler in June 1941? Suvorov was then encouraged by Russi to seal the debate with the last word. Within a year, Suvorov's article was turned into a book in Russian and a couple of years later published in English and German under the title The Icebreaker. In the book, Rezun now elaborated his views and depicted Soviet Russia as the villain rather than the victim in June 1941. He made an unsubstantiated claim that throughout 1939 to 1941, Stalin had been meticulously preparing a revolutionary war against Germany. Suvorov even professed to know the code name of the operation, Groza, which means thunder, and that it was destined for the 6th of July 1941, alas, was foiled by Hitler's preventive war on the 22nd of June 1941. As is so common with conspiracy genre, the conclusions are not sustained by any archival material, but rest on two theoretical assumptions. The first one is that since 1927, Stalin was pursuing a Marxist ideological paradigm which aimed at fomenting an inter-capitalist world war between Germany and the Western European countries, which would create conducive conditions for the Soviet Union to spread the world revolution into the heart of Europe. And the second is that the size, composition, and might of the Red Army and its pattern of deployment in June 1941 were offensive rather than defensive. On the whole, those ideas are presented in a pseudo-scientific fashion and without resorting to archival material. I quote, I worked for a bit in the archives of the Soviet Ministry of Defense, he recalls, but I have consciously, almost entirely, avoided archival material. Suvorov further indulges in a rather crude cavalier treatment of memoirs he uses as the foundation of his theory. Now, his views would have never taken seriously in academic circles had they not coincided at the time with the raging Historikerstreit in Germany, the rancorous debate on the nature and course of German history. The icebreaker fitted in like a glove in the debate, serving Professor Nolte, Hoffmann, Maser, Post, and others who condoned Hitler's move to the East as a preventive war, vindicated by tradition German geopolitical interests, and the threat posed to Germany and the civilized Western world by the abhorrent communist regime. The obvious political and ideological bent of the debate explains why the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Der Spiegel, and Focus continue to digest it ad nausea even today. When the German translation of my book, The Grand Illusion, exposed in Germany for the first time the operational plans of the Red Army, which discounted the possibility of an offensive Russian war, it evoked a furious reaction. Augstein, the renowned founder and editor of Der Spiegel, wrote a long review of the book starting with the words, "We do not need an Israeli academic to teach us our history." I should add that he died the following week. Likewise, the Munich-based rival Focus devoted considerable space to the debate, significantly not under the book review section, but rather under Deutschland, as you can see here. Suvorov's ideas continue to prevail in the historical as well as the political scene. They had serious repercussions on Russian relations with Poland and the Baltic states in the wake of the demise of the Soviet Union. They inspired, for instance, the former Prime Minister of Estonia, Mart Laar, to publish an article in the Wall Street Journal in August 2004 entitled, "When Will Russia Say Sorry?" In this article he claimed, "The new evidence in Suvorov's book shows that by encouraging Hitler to start World War II, Stalin hoped to simultaneously ignite a worldwide revolution and conquer all of Europe. The same arguments had been propagated by the Baltic head of states and 2 years ago by the late Polish President Kaczynski, which led to a major crisis in relations between Russia and Poland. Even when it came to the most recent tragedy, the crash of President Kaczynski's plane, Suvorov was quick off the mark in his usual style. Interviewed in the Polish paper Nasz Dzień, this is what he inter alia had to say. Though I do not know the details of the tragedy near Smolensk, all the same, so long as Putin is at the helm, political terror will prevail. Many awkward things happened at the place of the Smolensk accident. I heard from one of the Polish journalists who was at the place of the wreckage that the FSB, the Russian security service, were there right on the spot to seize the black box. I immediately said, they are trying to hide something. All of that is very strange. Now, the incredible enthusiasm with which Suvorov's book was received when it was finally published in Russia itself in 1993 is mind-boggling. The book immediately captivated the imagination of the Russian public at large, which, one should remember though, was fully engrossed at the time in the process of de-Stalinization. After all, the victory in the Second World War was still attributed to Stalin's wise leadership. Presenting him as an aggressor, a warmonger, and a fierce communist would rob him of the little respect he still commanded. The book was so successful that it sold around 10 million copies, more than any other book to have been published in the Russian Federation since 1991. It was subject of an 8-part documentary in prime time on the first channel of the Russian state television, and time and again features in the Russian media. What I found astounding was the ominous silence within the community of the Russian historians. This may, of course, be explained by the fear that any response at that time would have been perceived in the mind of 1990s as a defense of Stalin. What a contrast to today's Russia. Last May, I took a refuge from a conference which was organized by Medvedev to mark the 65th anniversary to the end of the war in Dom Knigi, Moscow's largest bookstore. There were 6 long bookshelves devoted to the Second World War. The top 3 boasted books on Stalin. The 4th was devoted to books on myth and conspiracies about the war. The entire 5th was devoted to Suvorov's books. The 6th to the rest. And so, in the meantime, Suvorov has published a whole series of books, cashing on his success. I'm just showing you the covers of them. And at a certain stage, he moved to what in Hollywood we call Shark 1, Shark 2. So now it's Aquarium 2 and Icebreaker 2. Far from diminishing, the icebreaker controversy continues to dominate the scene in both Russian and Western historiography. Last year, a new work was published by the Canadian historian Albert Wick, Stalin's Other War, Soviet Grand Strategy, 1939-41, followed in Germany by a very disturbing book by Musil, Kampfplatz Deutschland, Stalin Kriegsplan gegen den Westen, Battlefield Germany, Stalin's war plans against the West, depicting Stalin as a revolutionary jihadist, and the equally notorious book of no less than Patrick Buchanan, Churchill, Hitler and the Unnecessary War, How Britain Lost the Empire and the West Lost the World, which uncritically adopts Suvorov's thesis. This book has been severely challenged by leading historians of Soviet foreign policy, foremost of them Ted Uldrichs of the University of North Carolina. Now let's return to the genesis of the debate. As I had been engaged in research work on the origins of the Second World War, I devoted a sabbatical year in Oxford to produce a major rebuttal in Russian because of the lack of any rebuttal in Moscow, which was published under the title Myth Ledakola, or the Icebreaker Myth, which then ignited the debate in Russia. So on the left you see Suvorov's original book, on the right mine, which was a great success in Western terms because it sold 40,000 copies. But that was, of course, a drop in the bucket compared to the 10 million of the other book. Now, I suspect that only few historians are exposed to such violent and virulent attacks as those which followed the publication of my book. Scores of smearing articles appeared, rewriting my biography, suggesting, for instance, that I was not really a born Israeli, teaching at Tel Aviv University, but rather a Russian, brought up in Nizhny Novgorod, educated in the party's high school, and serving in the KGB. Only the last point is correct. But the worst was still to come. The years 1993 to 2000 were a narrow window of opportunity for doing archival research in Moscow. Much of the material which I was able to consult and eventually use in my grand delusion is again closed for research, unfortunately. So I spent the winter of 1998 to 1999 in Moscow working in the archives. Emerging out of the metro after a day of work in the archives into a biting snow blizzard, my eyes caught the sight of dozens of copies of an ominously looking new book by Suvorov lying on the bookstalls outside the station. What struck me right away was the brazen jacket of the book, not realizing as yet that the skull on the cover was no less than my own, as you can see. Since then, the skull has appeared in many other countries and languages. Here, for instance, is the Czech example. I then spent a sleepless night devouring the book, which to a large extent is targeted at me. It played on the widespread xenophobia in Russia, repeatedly referring to my foreign nationality, portraying me alternately as a Jew, and I quote, as the enemy of the Russian people. The whole book, Suvorov argues, is against us, passing judgment on our commanders. And he supposedly quotes me. I underline supposedly. The commanders, 40% are idiots, characterless, cowards, etc. Interesting. Has the great mathematician Gorodetsky reached these numbers on his own, or has someone helped him? In the West, they like accuracy. They like to see everything expressed in numbers. The exact percentage of the imbeciles in the Red Army is presented in a scientific method. I only think that for scientific credibility, they would have done better providing me with a less precise number, say 41.3%. Now, I'm referring to this citation and to the whole chapter, which evolves from it, to demonstrate to you Suvorov's methods of twisting evidence and diverting attention from the main issues. In this particular case, for instance, I was in fact quoting from a secret speech made by Stalin to the commanders of the Red Army, scolding them for the dismal performance of the army in the Winter War in Finland. And so he was putting Stalin's words in my mouth. Suvorov unscrupulously takes, as I said, Stalin's words. All that is a build-up, though, towards the grand finale in his book, an appeal to the high command of the Russian army from which he had defected some 25 years earlier. Brother paratroopers, naval and air officers, the honor of our motherland is at stake. Gorodetsky's wild fabrication has been fully supported by the Russians' ideological machine. And Gorodetsky, throwing aside all restraint, continues to speak about our cowardice, these are still Stalin's words, and about our gross unpreparedness. Brother paratroopers, should I provide you with a cue as to what needs to be done, or perhaps you will defend your motherland without being prompted? It was while I was writing my rebuttal that I became aware of the poor state of the historiography of the Second World War in general and the origins of the war in the East in particular. The predominance of social and intellectual history, the undisputed triumph of the Annales School, has tossed diplomatic and political history to the dustbin of history. And a glorious tradition of political history has been replaced by either pseudo-history or by histories fraught with ideological prejudices and laden with emotions. Unfortunately, this is particularly true for the generation brought up and educated, and I'm one of them, under what now seems to have been the stifling intellectual atmosphere of the Cold War. Now, what I would like to emphasize, that at least in the sphere of foreign policy, the examination of the archival sources in Moscow, deposited the President Archives, the Russian Foreign Ministry, General Staff, strikes one with the total absence of ideological jargon at the top. The state papers could have just as well been composed in Whitehall in London, the Quai d'Orsay in Paris, or the State Department in Washington. Rather ironically, it appears that the nomenclatura enjoyed the privilege of not being subjected to the tedious revolutionary rhetoric which was reserved for meetings of workers over lunch in the factories or the pages of Izvestia and Pravda. Even more exciting for me was the discovery of the extent to which Stalin's statesmanship was rooted in Russia's Tsarist legacy and responded to challenges which had deep historical roots. What struck me, flipping through the dusty, hitherto unseen archival folders in Moscow, was how little was Stalin affected by sentiments or ideological predilections in pursuing foreign policy. And I quote, "The issue of doctrines should never be confused," he said, "with issues concerning contemporary politics and the relations between states." Or on other occasions, when accused by Western press that Russia was conducting in Southeast Europe a Platonic policy, Stalin commented, "I have read Plato, but I do not really see the relevance. We simply pursue a realistic policy rather than sentimental. We save our sentiments for caressing the heads of small children and pets. But in practice, we do not conduct sentimental policy in relation to any country, be that Slav or not, be that small or big." Now, it's important to remember that the contemporaries were equally aware of the direction of Soviet foreign policy. Churchill's famous quip, for example, that Russia was a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, has been often evoked to demonstrate the sinister, dark nature of the country. No historian, to the best of my knowledge, has ever bothered to examine the context of Churchill's comment, extracted from a radio speech delivered in October 1939. Strangely enough, Churchill was in fact advocating a rapprochement with Russia, providing a solution to the enigma. The key, he continued, is Russian national interest. It cannot be in accordance with the interest and safety of Russia that Germany should plant herself upon the shores of the Black Sea, or that she should overrun the Balkan states and subjugate the Slavonic peoples of southeastern Europe. That, Churchill concluded, would be contrary to the historic life interest of Russia. Stalin's foreign policy, therefore, appears to have been rational and level-headed, an unscrupulous realpolitik, serving well-defined geopolitical interests. The unrestrained balance of power policy was blended with a Metternich-like belief that relations between states had to be determined by consensus among like-minded rulers. It is hardly surprising that in the execution of his foreign policy, Machiavelli, no less than Lenin, was Stalin's idol. Stalin even had the prince especially translated for him, always at an easy reach in his library, and heavily marked in his thick blue pencil, though obviously his policy was colored by cultural ideological perceptions. So the history of the crucial period from 1939 to 41, from the signature of the Ribbentrop Pact to the German invasion of Russia, can best illustrate the relationship between ideology and realpolitik in Soviet foreign policy. I should emphasize at this stage that this period was a lacuna both in Western and Soviet historiography for various reasons. The Russians simply wrote off this period during Stalin's period, while the West used it in order to emphasize the German-Soviet collaboration and project the hatred towards the old enemy on the new one, which had just been an ally. And yet, strangely enough, Stalin's apologetic explanation of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact has been and still is adopted uncritically, almost verbatim by the West. Stalin argued that the refusal of England and France to conclude a military alliance with the Soviet Union in 1939 left him with no choice but to sign an agreement with Hitler, assuming that war between the two countries was inevitable at the end, and that Russia was in a desperate need of a breathing space to prepare for a major clash. Now, the starting conclusion of my research, and at this stage I can only put in one sentence, is that contrary to the accepted wisdom, Stalin's objective in signing the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was not, as he staunchly held so far, to gain time for the inevitable clash. In fact, he was convinced that he could successfully avoid war altogether. In other words, the Nazi-Soviet collaboration was not transient and precarious, but seemed to have long-lasting prospects. In elaborating my narrative, I ought to draw your attention to the fact that the period of 39 to 41 is perhaps the most dynamic epoch ever in European history in terms of the transformation which occurred over a short period of less than 2 years, affecting almost every single country in the continent. And naturally, under such circumstances, a single simple explanation like ideology or similar ones tends to be superficial, if not biased. It is necessary to place the different geographic theaters and complex political, military, ideological, cultural, intelligence, economic issues under a single spotlight. Now, having done just that, my conclusion is that Stalin's objective in signing the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was to redress the grievances which he felt had been inflicted on Russia not only at Versailles in the peace conference, when Russia lost vast territories in the war period, but also in the course of the whole 19th century, during the struggle for the mastery in Europe. The rich Russian archival material reveal, rather surprisingly, that Stalin's major efforts, right up to the German invasion of Russia, did not focus on German threats posed to Russia. Stalin's gaze, like that of the Tsars who had preceded him, was set on the Balkans, the littoral of the Black Sea, and the Turkish Straits, rather than on the heart of Europe. In fact, when Dimitrov, the president of Comintern, pushed him to exploit the situation for a revolution, Stalin personally warned Dimitrov that in the first imperialist war, which is the First World War, the Bolsheviks overestimated the situation, so he's critical of Lenin. We all rushed ahead and made mistakes. This can be explained but not excused by the conditions prevailing then. Today we must not repeat the position held by the Bolsheviks then. And it is little known that in fact Stalin decided on the eve of the war in mid-April to unshake the foundations of the Communist International by advocating national communism. The Communist International, Stalin explained to Dimitrov, was created under Marx in the expectation of an approaching international revolution. The Comintern was created by Lenin in such a period too. Today, national tasks for each country have top priority. Do not hold on to what was yesterday. Take into account exactly the new conditions which have been created. So, rather than defeatism, when Stalin and the Russians were preaching peace, or the peace campaign, at the outbreak of war, the intention was genuinely peace. In other words, they were expecting, rather than a war, they were expecting a peace conference, which would probably occur in 1941-42, after the defeat of France. So the main thrust of Stalin's policies between 1939 to 41 was to acquire the best cards with which he could play at the anticipated peace conference. He expected the conference to be attended by a debilitated British Empire, to topple the Versailles Agreement, acknowledge the new Soviet security arrangements in Central and Northern Europe, but more interestingly, and this is missing from most of the literature written so far, is that he wanted to redress the damage inflicted on Russia in the 19th century, especially in the Paris Peace Treaty of 1856, which followed the Crimean War and the Congress of Berlin following the Russia-Turkish War in 1877-8. Now, what I would like to do is to illustrate to you, actually with maps for a couple of minutes, this legacy that I'm talking about. And I want you to remember that at the time that we are talking about, politicians resorted mostly to maps. I mean, they conducted policy with maps. All embassies had maps on the walls. When the war broke out, the first thing Churchill did was to create the map room in which the most important decisions were taken. When the United States ended the war, the first thing that Roosevelt did was to emulate Churchill by setting a map room in the White House itself. And of course, in the Cold War, we exchanged the physical maps and did away with geopolitical consideration, and we exchanged them with mental maps, which reflected more ideological concepts than geography. Okay, this is a map, an early map of the annexations of Turkish territory by Catherine the Great. What I would like you to see mostly is the fact that the annexations brought Russia to the mouth of the Danube. That was extremely important because the Danube is, of course, not just a wonderful river, but about 50% of transport in Europe was carried on board of the Danube. And the moment that the country became a Danube power, it in fact became a European country. So this was, for Russia, an important entry into Europe by becoming a Danube power. And it completed the other side of the coin, which was the division of Poland, which allowed Russia to get into Europe in the central scene. So this is the ideal of Russian, almost the ideal of Russian expansionism, which is a very limited scope. It's not an expansion with no end, but expansion which serves political interests. Now, this is the flow of the Danube. This is the Danube, just to give you the sense of the size of it. And this is Europe in 1815. It shows you how Russia had succeeded actually in becoming a European country by those annexations in the south and in the center. Now, shortly afterwards came the Crimean War, and one of the results of the Crimean War is that Russia was pushed out of Bessarabia and therefore away from the Danube. And by so doing, Britain and France had actually moved Russia again from Europe. And we can see that also here in this map. This is what Russia missed. And so the Russian aim was therefore to regain control of the Danube on the one hand, and also prevent the French and the British from actually entering to the Black Sea. And this they did when they used a massacre against the Slavic population in the Bulgarian area in 1877 to start a war which did not only help the poor massacred Slavs, but went all the way almost to the Straits, up to San Stefano, which is today the airport in Istanbul. And by so doing, they managed to create a new entity called the Large Bulgaria, which, as you can see, bears no resemblance to today's Bulgaria, controlled the entire mouth of the Danube and also the Straits. And they forced this agreement on Turks in San Stefano in 1978. Here is the new Bulgaria. Now, one thing they didn't take into account was the rise, of course, of Germany at that time. And so in 1870, Bismarck brought about all the major representatives of the major powers and created the new reality where Bulgaria was again cut, in fact, into two countries. And the only thing you can see, an interesting thing, is that the Russians did not object to what was really happening in Bulgaria and Romania. But one thing that did insist was to get Bessarabia and to remain a Danubian state. And by so doing, actually remain a European state. Now, this is the situation after the revolution. And as you can see very clearly in this area, the Russians again had been pushed away from the Danube. And this is a map I really cherish because this is a map of the Ukrainian Republic created in the early 20s. Now, what you see is that the Russians actually adhere to the old Tsarist borders. And so the claim here is the Ukraine. And here's the area of Bessarabia that they lost. So they have a claim, in fact, to Bessarabia. They don't have a claim to the rest of Europe. I mean, they should have actually got rid of all those borders with their revolutionary aspirations. But it's actually confined to these traditional aims. And this is the famous Ribbentrop Molotov map. dividing Poland. And this is the map we are used to see, usually, when we look at the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. But maps are drawn, of course, by people who have got perception of what they want others to see. And what we don't see in this map, you see in the map that I drew here, and this is that the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was not satisfactory from the Russian point of view because the entire South, or the Balkans issue, was not resolved. And therefore, Stalin devoted the next 2 years to resolve the Balkan issue and come to the peace conference with actually having settled the Balkan issue and the South. And so, in fact, what he hoped to do was to control, again, the Danubian the mouth, and also to encourage Bulgaria to annex, in fact, Dobruja, and therefore create this continued stretch under Soviet sphere of influence. So a very 19th century concept. And that is actually what happened throughout the period. Stalin, for instance, hoped to recruit Italy, Mussolini, to his side, which shows you that the ideological concern wasn't so important. He wrote to Mussolini at that time, "What you want is to establish your legitimate rights in the Mediterranean, just as the Soviet Union has the legitimate right to full control of the Black Sea, which must be exclusively Russian. The present regime of the Straits can no longer be maintained and has to be altered." Sounds like the First World War, really, in terms of the war objectives. So we usually have this picture of Molotov visiting Hitler in Berlin in 1940, and it is suggested quite often that what he wanted to do was, in fact, to divide with Hitler the entire world. But in fact, I was lucky enough to find in Russian archive, in the presidential archive, this document, which are the directives to the meeting in Berlin in Molotov's handwriting, which was dictated to him by Stalin in Stalin's dacha. You can see the pages torn from notebook. And they are all limited and confined to the area that I described to you before. They focus on the mouth of the Danube, they focus on the littoral of the Black Sea, and the need to control the straits, not actually to control Constantinople or occupy it, but to be in a position like being in San Stefano, which would prevent the British and the French from coming in. And so, in fact, this leads to a completely new interpretation of everything that was happening between 1939 to 1941, because, for instance, the Neutrality Pact with Japan, which was signed in April 1941, has always been explained as an attempt by Stalin to prevent war on two fronts. But that would assume that he actually expected war. And in fact, this was not the case, because what he wanted was, and I quote from a document that he prepared for the meeting with Matsuoka, the Japanese Foreign Ministry, the agreement, he said, would smooth the collaboration with the tripartite pact partners. And in April 1941, he was even toying with the idea of joining the axis of Italy, Germany, and Japan. And likewise, the support of the rebellion of the Yugoslavs against the Germans in Belgrade in April 1941 was not a defiance to Hitler, as is presented in most of the literature in the period, both Soviet and Western, but rather a deterrent which aimed, in fact, at luring Hitler to the negotiating table. Stalin was further misled by Count von Schulenburg, the German ambassador to Moscow, who had been the architect of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, because he was determined to prevent a war and was trying to bring about a meeting between Hitler and Stalin in clandestine meetings, again, of records of which I found out in the Soviet archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so there were three important meetings on the 5th and 12th and 13th of May 1941 in his own residence. And this further deflected Stalin from the danger. But the first time that Stalin took seriously the German Strait was actually only at the end of 1940. So he was not preparing his military for the war, the aggressive war, the way that Suvorov described. But in fact, the first time was when he got this intelligence report And this is a report from the military attaché in Germany, Berlin, 29th of December 1940, 10 days after Hitler had signed the directive on Operation Barbarossa, to which only about 8 people were privy. And it says, the first name is crossed out, someone informed that somebody else has gleaned from the most well-informed high military circles that Hitler has given the order to prepare for war with the USSR. War will be declared in March 1941. Instructions have been given to verify the information. And a subsequent telegram, beginning of January, quite a long one, ends with the sentence, this information is based not on rumors, but on a special order of Hitler, which is most secret and which very few people are privy to. So only then did Stalin test the military in these 2 famous war games and a theoretical conference of the military high command in the Kremlin, and both demonstrated, in fact, the poor state of the Soviet military, and convinced Stalin even further that he should, in fact, pursue appeasement with Hitler at all costs and try to prevent the war. So, ironically, we find Stalin in a situation which is so reminiscent of Chamberlain's after the Munich conference of 1938, when the inability, in fact, to react so late in the day to the danger lurking led him to outright reject any intelligence, because any of the intelligence could be explained in various ways. I can expand on that later on in the discussion. It could be, for instance, attributed to a war of nerves, or in preparation for the negotiations, in an attempt to get some better terms from the Russians. So this best explains, in fact, the fateful failure of the intelligence. Even when Zhukov, the chief of staff, and Timoshenko, the commissar for the defense, became convinced that war was inevitable, which was about a month before the war, or 2 months, Stalin resisted any pressure to act. On the 14th of May, this is something that I contributed to Suvorov because he wasn't aware of it, and now he's using it, but in the wrong way. On the 14th of May, Zhukov prepared a plan for preemptive attack on the German deployment. And this is the directive. It was, in fact, handwritten, as you can see, and distributed only in 2 copies. One went to the Ministry of Defense, one went to Stalin. And it said, look at the context, considering that the present Germany is keeping its army fully mobilized, with the rear deployed, it is in a position to forestall us by mounting a surprise attack. To prevent this, I think it is essential not to allow the German High Command to seize the initiative on any account, to forestall the deployment of the enemy, and to attack the German army at the moment when it is in the middle of deployment and before it has successfully completed the formation of the front and the coordination of the movement of the various forces. So the plan was rejected by Stalin right away, and he, in fact, prevented Zhukov from even deploying the troops on the front. A month later, on the 12th of June, Zhukov and Timoshenko plucked courage, and one needed quite a courage to do what they did, and they demanded to speak to the Politburo. And they came armed with maps and recent intelligence that showed the German intention, but they found it defiant Stalin. What are you up to, he said, proposing to carry out mobilizations throughout the country, increase our forces now, and move them to the western borders? That means war. Do you two understand that or not? And what, have you come to scare us with war, or do you want a war? Aren't you sufficiently decorated, or your rank is not high enough? And then Zhukov insisted on showing the maps, and Stalin and Timoshenko supported him, and Timoshenko left with his aide-de-camp at the time a lively record of this meeting. Stalin returned to the table and spoke harshly. It is all Timoshenko's work. He's preparing everyone for war. He ought to be shot. But I've known him as a good soldier since the Civil War. Anyway, Stalin said, Timoshenko is a fine man with a big head, but clearly a small brain. At this he showed his thumb. I said it for the people, referring to a speech to the military academy on the 5th of May when Stalin suggested that war was inevitable. We have to raise their alertness, while you have to realize that Germany on her own will never fight Russia. You must understand this. And he left. He then opened the door and stuck his pockmarked face around it and uttered in a loud voice, "If you are going to provoke the Germans on the frontier by moving troops there without our permission, then heads will roll, mark my words." And he slammed the door. Exactly the same words that Churchill used about his generals, with this one exception, that heads didn't roll in England. So the rest of the story is well known. When Zhukov telephoned Stalin at his dacha at 3:30 in the morning of the 22nd of June to inform him of the German attack, Stalin still appeared to believe that the Wehrmacht was provoking a war without Hitler's authorization. It was only 2 weeks later, after a severe nervous breakdown and the recognition of his miscalculations throughout 1939 to 41, that Stalin was able to regain the reins of power, restore his leadership, and harness national support in the defense of the motherland this time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roger. Okay, we have a good half hour for discussion. Maybe let me start out by prodding Gabi on a couple of points. One, could you just talk a little bit more about archival access and the kinds of materials you've seen for your book, given the sleight of hand that Mr. Suvorov has given to archival research, and you mentioned that some of these documents are no longer accessible, but even at the time in the 1990s, it certainly was a coup to get into the very closed presidential, very inaccessible presidential archives. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about this, and certainly, I also want to make sure that these materials aren't locked away now in the Gorodetsky archive. Secondly, I want to push you a little bit on this issue of ideology versus realpolitik. You discounted the role of ideology on Stalin's part, and you focused very much on the Russian imperial tradition and legacy. Could you just talk a little? I mean, clearly it's a little bit more complicated than that. So I'd like to just push you. What role did ideology play for Stalin?
No, if you want to push me, you have to tell me what is your take on the ideology, because I would argue there wasn't one. So you have to present a narrative, or a basic narrative, that I would then
you would
because sorry, what I would when I say ideological, is ideological the way that we have been treating ideology, which is that the Marxist ideology had a blueprint. The blueprint was Russia wanted the war. Stalin wanted the war since actually the revolution, because the war would be a stepping stone to revolution, you see. And then we have to prove that Stalin wanted war throughout, that he expected a revolution to happen as a result. I've been able, so I hope, to prove that he didn't expect a war, and that what he wanted was, in fact, to get to a peace conference, and I've presented just a sample of documents, but it's all in, of course, in my book, showing that that was the way he was acting, and that there was no ideological, revolutionary, or blueprint sort of ideological. I wouldn't say that he didn't believe in socialism, or that one day the world will be a communist world, but none of that is actually reflected in the policies of that time.
Okay, that's what I wanted to, the documents and access.
Yes, documents access, again, it's not for me to I'm trying to see. Suvorov has been, in fact, suggesting, I mean, he didn't produce any document. He has not been able to produce the most important document, which would be the one of a directive, the military, to prepare for the war with a name. We have also a code name and a date. So he hasn't been able to do. He can only draw from various. I'll give you an example. His letter called, the Icebreaker, starts with a chapter called the T-34, it all is very similar to the way he attacked me about attacked me, suggesting, that I think that the Red Army are imbeciles and so on, while it was in fact Stalin saying those words. And so the first chapter is called T-34. Now, T-34 was a very innovative Russian tank. The innovation there was that it could shed off the tracks and then actually continue to run on wheels. And then the question is, why T? Because it was called, this tank was called A-34, while all the Russian tanks were, of course, the T. So why A? Why A? And then he comes with the solution. A, because it stands for Autostrad. And so this tank was, in fact, supposed to get to the German autostrads and then shed off the tracks and rush into Berlin. So if you accept that as an evidence, then fine. I have no answer for that. Or the second chapter is called The Boots. And he recalls the time of the Czech, of when he was involved as he was a lieutenant, I think, in the tank division, and they invaded Czechoslovakia. And the day before they invaded, they got new boots. And while they were getting the new boots, the sergeant, who was an elderly man and had fought in the Second World War, remembered that on the 6th of July, the day before, that they were supposed, or just 2 weeks before, they got new boots. And so you have to assume that every time that the Soviet Union is about to invade, they get new boots, you see. So this is the kind of arguments that he uses in these chapters. And then he misquotes, for instance, Vasilievsky in his memoirs, saying, in 1941, in June, we got to a stage where it was no longer possible for us to sit idle because we saw all this concentration, and we had to move. And he says, he quotes, move to the attack. But in the original it says counterattack. So there is a difference between counterattack and, as you can see in Zhukov's idea, I mean, the whole directive is actually written knowing that the German are deployed opposite you. So the German threat is there. So you can't just ignore it the way that Suvorov suggests it was. So he has no sources. Let's start with that. He has no sources. No, I haven't seen a single source because he was not privy to archival. It's not only foreigners or not. I mean, a captain in the GRU would be allowed into those places which no one had actually seen at the time. This is the first one. Now, as to the access I had, there are two ways of approaching research on the Soviet Union. The one is to say, well, the archives are not acting the way that we would like them to act. In other words, there are no rules, and we can't get free access, and therefore we're not going to do any archival work. And some of the leading scholars in my field have adopted this attitude. So until the Russians really comply with what we think is a proper access, we're not going to do research. The other is to find your ways through. And I was lucky in a way because at that time I was earmarked to be the Israeli ambassador in Moscow, and that went on for a whole year. And while it was going to be a political nomination, which didn't happen because unfortunately there was a change of governments there, and the present government is still in place. But the old one was going to send me to Moscow. And in the years sort of preceding it, I started a project which led to a joint publication of the documents, Soviet-Israeli, the official publication. As a result of that, I got to know the archivist, and I had access which others did not. I admit to it. I had access to many places which other historians did not. That does not mean that the Russians fed me, as he suggests, with documents that they wanted me to see. And as for the presidential archives, I certainly did not have a free access, and not an access which is satisfactory in the sense that I can say, no, there are no other documents. So I had a limited, to the presidential I had a limited, but I had a whole run of all the intelligence that Stalin received from 1940 to 1941. I had a whole run of the military directives, and they are numbered and numbered also within the document. So there is not a missing directive, which would be the directive on the attack. So I'm quite happy with what I had. Unfortunately, a very complicated situation in the 1990s, because a lot of documents in the anarchy of the 1990s, a lot of documents were stolen. I was shown in Germany, someone was trying to sell me incredible documents which relate to Stalin's offers of a separate peace in 1942-43, a whole folder. And I know those documents well enough to know that it was not a forgery. And they were stolen. And historians would never lay their hands on them again, because, of course, they wanted millions, and I wouldn't have bought them anyway. So the closing of the archives had two sides to it. First of all was the administrative side. The other one was the political one, because in the early 90s, it was a window of opportunity, because the new Russian government didn't feel responsible for the Soviet period. And it took time until Primakov came to office, and then Putin, when the legacy and the continuity in policy made them feel that they are responsible also for the Soviet period. It's a little bit like the Germans and the Nazi periods. And so they started closing again, things which at first they didn't care actually opening, and especially the papers of the party, which were the most interesting and important.
Okay, thank you. Charlie Mayer. Oh, hold on for the mic, Charlie.
I got you. Oh, thank you. Well, I'm totally in sympathy with this, your position, this view, etc. And I remember being in Leningrad in the early 90s and finding to my dismay that all these Russian liberals, as I thought them, just wanted to believe this. So the question I really have is, and I discount ideology too in this sense, the question though I have is in what sense did Stalin think he would get to a peace conference without a conflict of some sort, and what was that to take place? And I'd also like you to look at the Bessarabian crisis, when Russia annexed Bessarabia and all that stuff, which I can never sort out very well, in the summer of 1940 with the Vienna settlements and everything. How does this precipitate? Do you think this is important in the precipitation of Hitler's plans, or if you'd go into that a bit?
Yeah, well, very good question. Especially the last one is an intriguing one. As I don't do sufficiently to the depth German history, one of the disturbing elements is the fact that Hitler's decision at the end of the day was taken. I mean, the timing of it was very much a result of the resilience and stubbornness he noticed with the Russians, with Molotov in Berlin, where he had this directive, which I showed you just one page, but there are 7 pages, and a very detailed sort of ideas on what Russia would want. And what Russia would want would be very much in line of what I try to explain rather superficially, but I had no time for that. And then 10 days later comes Directive Barbarossa. Now the question is, again, was the war, from the German point of view, was it really inevitable? Was it ideologically motivated? Were there also rational considerations in Hitler's decision? And this is this is the ball that I'm throwing back into the German court now that we know what the Russian side was after, and the Germans were fully aware of the way, because there was tremendous support. This is something I did examine in Germany. There was tremendous support for what Russia was proposing in the German foreign ministry, especially among von Weizsäcker, but also Ribbentrop to a large extent. The ideas of the continental bloc then have to be reconsidered. Would have that prevented the ideological war is difficult to say. Related to it is Stalin's failure here was a result of something we encounter to our very days, and this is his projection of his own ideas on Hitler, or the sort of split image, assuming that Hitler, like him, he's saying all those things. I mean, of course, he knew what is written in Mein Kampf and so on, but he would dismiss it the same way that he would dismiss what Lenin wrote on 1915, and he would assume Hitler to act rationally. And therefore, when the intelligence started accumulating, he developed a theory that, like in his case in Russia, the military were actually not at one with Hitler. They were pushing to the war while Hitler was restraining them, and therefore one should do everything possible not to provoke them, and that would explain also his own inactivity. So it is an intriguing issue now that we have this idea, you know.
It does seem to me that the status quo of 1914 would have been obviously in the stable resting point if these were both normal statesmen. I mean, and Stalin felt this way too, because he discussed this with Molotov in those famous conversations afterward, and but the Germans were not ready for that. They really, you know, the reannexation of the Baltic states and Bessarabia. So it's just interesting. Why? The other thing is to think about what Hitler was facing, the defeat of the campaign against Britain, obviously. So there is this sort of dynamism. I have to go. Perhaps one has to go someplace to keep up the movement. But I think it would be nice to that year in there is.
1940,
you know,
the summer of 1940.
Yeah, is really is critical, and the fall too, when that famous visit. Yeah.
Just to answer your first question, he was indeed thinking of the peace conference. Now, the idea of the peace conference was changing the balance of power in Europe. It's the old 19th century game, whereby Russia and Germany now would be the major powers, and in fact he was prepared to give Hitler the control of most of Europe except for the littoral of the Black Sea. This is again the traditional Russian interest, and also the control of the Danube and the Baltic states, and the division of Poland, which was accepted by the Germans at least in 1939. So that was not a surprise to Hitler. What was a surprise to Hitler, and a nasty surprise, was the fact that the Russians were now making the claim, you know, to the littoral and so on, and in fact that implied some sort of control over Romania, from where they were getting their oil, and the control of the Danube, through which they were actually transferring a lot of the oil from Romania to Germany, strangely enough, but that's the way it was done, on barges.
Thank you. Bruce Parrott? Hold on for the mic, Bruce.
Right behind you.
Thank you, Gabby, for this very stimulating presentation. I'm just reading your book now, and I think it's a splendid book. I've learned an enormous amount from it. But I want to come back to this issue of ideology again. And it seems to me that you have effectively rebutted what I would call a sort of fundamentalist interpretation of the role of ideology in Soviet foreign policy at a particular time. But that's not the same as saying that ideology of some sort didn't play a role in Soviet policy at some times, because you can point to this emphasis on national communism in 1940-41, or the abolition of the Comintern in 1943, but then a common forum was created in 1947 again, which had an important ideological element. So I guess the question is where in the hierarchy of objectives ideology ranked for Stalin and other members of the leadership. And I imagine its position fluctuated over time depending on how they assessed the overall situation. And the other complicating factor is that ideology was a very important foreign policy tool. The fact that you had important social groups in other countries which believed in the ideology, communist parties, supporters of communist parties. So you had to profess these things partly to manipulate them for diplomatic reasons. So it's just an awfully complicated situation. And I think there were probably people inside the Soviet leadership who didn't agree on when ideology should govern and when it shouldn't govern. So my only caution is that I'm not sure we can generalize from this case to general conclusions about Soviet policy.
Well, I've devoted, my work and history, and I've devoted my entire career actually looking at this duality. And I examined very carefully the 20s, and now through the diary I'm doing the 30s, and then the war period, and then the Cold War, which I think very much is, in fact, consequential on the earlier periods and cannot be explained just in the conditions prevailing after the war. Now, in this situation of the, as I said, I don't think the Russians abandoned ideology, or they did not think that they were socialists, or did not believe that eventually communism, socialism would reign. In fact, it's rather amazing when you look at Maisky's diary. He talks with most of the British politicians, including the conservatives, in the 20s and the 30s. There was this sense of decadence, of the decaying capitalism, decaying imperialism, and so on. So there was a sense that the change would come, and the question was the nature of the change. Now, what happens with the Russians is that at first you have this belief, the revolution is around the corner, and its strategy and tactics are interwoven. But throughout the 20s, the idea of the revolution sort of becomes remote, and all the attempts to maintain duality fails, because you come to crises like the General Strike 1926. What do? Here you have a general strike which you didn't promote, you didn't ignite, you think it will undermine your state interest, but it is a general strike and you're the Soviet Union. What do? So you whatever you do, you actually lose. And that led to the severance of relation, and I think that's the most important lesson that Stalin learned when he came to power. And then, of course, you have the same situation in Spain, which completely undermined, and this also comes out very clearly in the diary, when Litvinov and Maisky and Stalin himself tried to make the contribution as minimal as possible, and not the way that we're used to think about it. So I think what happens is the ideology is there. It's the frame of mind. It colors also the way they see the West, which is the most important thing. But that's not the blueprint. And so that would not lead. They do accept the fact that socialism is actually now established in Russia, and the main objective is actually to construct socialism in Russia. You see, and the ideological frame of mind colors the judgment of the others, as it does on the other side as well.
All right. Thank you. The gentleman over here, if you could just state your name and affiliation since you weren't there earlier.
Sorry, my name is Anand Toprani. I'm at Georgetown University. I wanted to ask a question that you touched upon very briefly during your exchange with Professor Meyer. It relates to Bessarabia and the issue of access to German oil supplies of Ploiești. That I understand, somebody gave me Suvorov's latest book in English. I forget what it was called, something about, again, how he is the cause of all evil. But I think the thesis of this book, supposedly, was that the annexation of Bessarabia, by moving the Soviet borders westwards, not only gave them access to the Danube, but put them into striking distance of the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, and that supposedly Germany was reacting to the threat posed to its oil supplies in 1941. Now, I never saw any evidence in German documents that they were concerned about a Soviet attack. If anything, they were concerned the Romanians would destroy the oil fields rather than anyone else. But it's not implausible to think this, that it might. It seems likely that this could have been a consideration. So I wanted to ask, did the Soviet Union appreciate Germany's economic vulnerability? Is there any evidence that this...
On the contrary, because they saw Germany as an ally. So the whole point was there you would have two major powers. The whole problem was really defining spheres of influence, defining territories, rather than thinking in terms of who poses a threat to whom. I mean, seen from the Russian point of view. One forgets that in 1940, the Russians perceived the British to be as much of an enemy as they perceived Germany, if not more. They almost got involved in a war with Britain on two occasions. One is the bombing of the Caucasus oil fields, and the other was, of course, during the Winter War. And the memory, of course, of the Crimean War, the intervention, 1877-8, and so on, came to the mind. And so they were not thinking, that's the whole point, they were not thinking of a German threat to Russia. Now, the other way around, I've seen the documents related to the occupation of Bessarabia, and I'm absolutely convinced that the annexation was... And also I've seen the Bulgarian documents, which are as interesting, because you can see the Russians trying to create a situation which is so very similar to 1877-8. In other words, to make the Bulgarians collaborate with them. In a way, it is against the Germans, but only in terms of creating the sort of division, the spheres of influence. And so this and the annexation of Bessarabia happens at the same time. And the Bulgarians are, of course, torn between the two pressures from Germany and from Russia. And eventually they go the German way because of the German successes on the battlefield. They could have just as easily gone with the Russians, as they had done always in history. So there's no mention of the oil. The oil is never a consideration. That's, again, a theory. But there's no documentary evidence to that.
Roger?
Gabby, just a brief historiographical question, because it seems to me that one of the things that you have done on the basis of massive archival research is to reaffirm some informed historical judgment before 1989, 1990. For example, could you just remind us what E.H. Carr thought in his writings about the German attack on Russia?
Not terrifically much, because his important book was, of course, a book on international affairs, and he actually completed the book in 1938, at the time when he was the leader writing for the Times in London, and was advocating appeasement, of course. So his views on Russia were very different from the views that he adopted later on when he became a historian of Russia. So in fact he wrote very little on 1941. And the same is true about A.J.P. Taylor, who was more sympathetic to the Russian cause in 1939 in the negotiations, mostly by being critical of the British rather than looking into the Russian affairs. So in fact, very little was written. There's in terms of research, proper research on this period.
Interesting.
Okay. Yeah, Jean-Pierre. It's coming.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. Really, the Russian missed a lot for not having you as an Israeli ambassador, and I'm sure the Israeli government too. You just, yes, you just touched upon this, the fact that intelligence reports were not believed because they were maybe part of a war of nerves. If you could elaborate, thank you very much.
Yes. Well, let me give you another example. Zorge, he's of course the other hero. Here you have Tokyo, 15th of June, 1941, and he's the military attaché has been told by the German courier who brings the material that he's convinced that war against the SSSR will likely start until the end of June. But then he adds another sentence. Will there be a war? He's not sure. So there's always ambivalence in the reports, including in Zorge's. And Stalin could, of course, do what... This is the problem that most of intelligence agencies face. I mean, they get contradictory, or they get intelligence which can be manipulated. And so and at a certain stage, especially in Russia, where you get to know what the boss wants to hear, you'll see Golikov, the head of the military intelligence, starting, as we get closer to the war, starting to sift through the intelligence and present Stalin with the intelligence which shows this ambivalence. he would be careful as to, and the same is done by Maisky, who is very much responsible in many ways to misleading Stalin on the eve of the war, because in fact the Russians were concerned that the Germans and the British were on the verge. It's a very complicated story, but they were concerned after Hess had landed in England in May 1941, Hitler's deputy, that in fact the British and the Germans were negotiating a separate peace, which may then lead to a war against Russia. And so you have these suspicions, and Maisky was very careful in his reportings before June 1941. And at a certain stage, on the 12th of June, Churchill agreed to part away with information gained from, this is not his famous warning. His famous warning is a very complicated issue. It's not a warning, I think. But on the 12th of June, he did have sufficient reports from Enigma about the transfer of the German Luftwaffe units to the Russian border. And of course, it was a dilemma, because disclosing this information to the Russians might have then made it clear to them that the British were reading the German secret codes. But nonetheless, he decided to transfer. But Maisky delayed transmitting this information for about 4 days, because he knew that that was not what Stalin wanted. He thought it was a conspiracy.
Okay, we're quickly running out of time. Sonia and Mel are on my list, but let me also couple of quick questions. Maisky, when will we see the edited diaries? And secondly,
it will be published posthumously. That's very soon.
And could you just, in responding to Bruce, you talked about the importance of understanding, and you can't understand Stalin's Cold War policy without the earlier phases. Could you just elaborate a little bit on that for the Cold Warriors in the room? But then, Sonia and okay, very good, Mel. Sorry, Sonia.
This may seem hopelessly naive, but I just want to clarify. Could you say a little bit more about why your work was received so coolly in the Soviet Union, in Russia, and why Suvorov's work was
in the sort of current young people's genre?
Yeah, what does it mean? What does it say about the current political topography in Russia, and the reception of Suvorov?
Well, I showed you these 6 shelves. This is today, and if you notice, the predominant shelf, I mean, let alone Stalin, are those books on myth and conspiracies. Because for some odd reason, the proper research on the period is still not conducted in Russia. And so everything is for the war period. Very few books, actually, written which are based on in an attempt to have an objective view, and it's all politicized again. And obviously my book did not fall within, that, but the importance of it was that it sparkled the debate in Russia. There was no debate. I mean, his book appeared. It was, at that time, there were no books on Stalin to be seen, and his book became the Bible, sort of, and none of the historians stood up. So obviously, his supporters, it's mostly a popular field, not among the historians. I mean, most historians will side with me today, but in the general public, and it is a kind of debate that involves the whole public.
What is the public culture? What is the public mood that he is feeding? I think that's why.
Yeah, what is it about the message?
Yeah.
Well, I think I mentioned it, that it was the last thing that stood for Stalin was his leadership in the war, and here comes this book. I mean, it's a very strange phenomenon where the Russians agree. I mean, every family has got at least someone who died in the war, and nonetheless they are prepared to accept, without any serious basis, this idea that Russia was actually the villain rather than the victim in the war. So that's a strange thing. But I think it's really connected to the de-Stalinization at the time. The other thing is that the genre of this conspiracy is a very good writer. It's not that he's a bad writer. He knows exactly how to manipulate that public opinion and to write to the masses, so to speak. And there's this lacuna. Don't forget, there was nothing known about 39 to 41. So anything would have been accepted. And he was the one to jump in the cold water first.
Right. What is it about the Cold War, about Stalin, that Cold War historians do not understand?
I don't remember me saying anything.
No, yeah, I'm exaggerating. But the question that Mel and I had.
Mel didn't ask any question.
Let me restate the question, Mel.
No, I'd just like you to extrapolate your thoughts about the role of ideology in terms of
of
the Cold War. You obviously believe that it was not critical, yet in recent, last 10 to 15 years, some of the really most famous Cold War historians like John Gaddis or Vlad Zubak, and even Arnie Westad.
Zubok is ambivalent about it.
But they all, in very different ways, talk about the role of ideology, not necessarily as a blueprint for conquest and not necessarily as a clear blueprint for revolution, but their views are very much affected by their emphasis on ideology in terms of understanding the way Soviet Union's adversaries are going to work, the way they understand threat perception, the way Stalin understands the international environment. In all those ways, they claim in different ways that ideology is really critical. And I was wondering what your thinking is about that.
For the Cold War period.
Well, you have to invite me to give a talk about it because it's unfair, in sort of 1 minute to give you a run on that, because I've been working actually since the time I was here at the Wilson Center, which was still in the castle in 1986. I'm accumulating material for a book which will deal with the 2.5 first years of the war. And I think that in order to understand really what happened in 45, and actually the Cold War historians usually start with 48 because 45 is considered to be prehistory for them. But I would say that in order to understand that, you have to, again, look at the 20s, 30s, and the 20s, of course, have the legacy and origins in the Tsarist thinking and so on. The situation of the Cold War, in one word, my take of it, is that it's a two sides event. It's not that one side is ideological and the other not. And in many ways, I feel that Stalin was forced to resort to ideology in order to justify a policy which was not actually ideological. I think that basically my bottom line would be the following thing. There is a tremendous consistency in defining national interests, which is also a definition of Russian identity and which is territorially oriented. In other words, the objectives are very clear. And what happened in the Cold War, this is my take on it, is that the situation at the end of the war in the failure to reach an agreement, which would be very similar to the kind of agreement they wanted to have with the Germans. They don't care whom they talk to. They can talk to Nazis, they can talk to bourgeois and capitalists. They are all the same for them. What they put as the most important thing, and this is what makes people always define them as cynical, is that national interests are the important thing. And it doesn't matter whom you negotiate with. You negotiate with whoever has got the power. It's power-oriented definition of policy. And therefore, I think that the ideology became an instrument and a tool rather than the main objective. And to a large extent, it was imposed on the Russian by the Americans stepping in British shoes, actually, in the conditions prevailing them. I've studied the Israeli-Soviet relations at that period, and one can see it so clearly. They're lacking any ideology, because the Jewish agency at that time, when they quoted the Russians, they would all the time play the socialist card. They will take them to the kibbutzim and show Ben-Gurion would say, I'm the head of the Zionist organization, but much more important for me is the fact that I'm head of the socialist movement. They will build this wonderful social. And then at the end of the day, the Russians went to the United Nations in 1947 with a decision not to call for partition. This is not terribly well known, but this is another document that we found. Not actually to bring about a partition, but a single state. And it was the conditions of the Cold War and the fact that they thought actually that the British and the Americans were conspiring to continue the mandate, that they introduced the partition and then dressed it with this with the Holocaust dress on it. So I see the continuity there, and I tend to minimize, even in the Cold War, the role of ideology per se as a driving force.
Thank you. Well, I think we're all excited to see that book when it's done. Thank you all for coming and joining us today, but thanks first and foremost to Gabi Gorodetsky for an inspiring and interesting, fascinating, stimulating talk here today. Thank you. Let's give him a round of applause.